You're making this big bet on the future of fossil fuels at a time when the world is moving away, pressure is mounting on companies to move away from fossil fuels. How does your strategy make sense?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank you, and thanks to the Journal for inviting me. I'm a longtime subscriber and a big fan of the work of you and your colleagues. Look, one of the big challenges for an energy company like ours is we've got a big business today that meets the needs of the world, and we've got customers and economies around the world that depend on what we do to keep the lights on and the trains going. And at the same time, we're working to reduce the impact on the environment, particularly greenhouse gas emissions of that business, and grow new businesses at the same time. And so we have to be able to do both. The world's still using a lot of oil and gas. This year, global oil demand is at the highest it's ever been in history, and it will grow again next year. And so the acquisition of Hess will allow us to continue to meet that demand. We produce about 1 billion barrels of oil every year. And we need to continue to replenish that as long as the world's using it. And we're also at the same time investing in lower carbon forms of energy. And as the demand for those grows, I think you'll see the mix evolve.
And can that happen fast enough to meet the goals of COP? You weren't there, but you've been watching closely, I'm sure. Can that mix shift quickly enough to meet the emissions goals in 2050?
Yeah, this is one of the really big challenges. And I think it's difficult for people that are not involved in the energy system to appreciate the scale of the global economy and what it takes to keep it going every day. If you go back 20 years ago, roughly 84% of global energy came from fossil fuels. We've had 20 years of awareness about climate change, of efforts to change the mix, build out wind and solar. Today, the world has much larger demand in total for energy, and about 82% of the energy remains fossil fuels. And so it's difficult to change that mix rapidly because of the infrastructure, the consumers of fuel, which tend to be buildings, ships, airplanes, things that have very long lives. And so the demand doesn't change as rapidly as I think a lot of people would like to see it.
John Kerry being one of those people, he called out fossil fuel producers and Chevron in particular for not doing enough, and he criticized you for not signing the Decarbonization pledge. Why didn't you sign that pledge?
We're very aligned with the intent of the pledge. There were some details of it that we were still working to understand better, but our goals are very much aligned with it, and we're doing a lot. When the Paris Agreement was ratified, we set targets to reduce our Scope 1 and 2 emissions by 40% by 2028. We're well on the way to do that. Reduce methane emissions by 50%. We've now issued 6 different climate reports, sequentially TCFD-aligned reports. We've issued a special methane report. We're investing to grow businesses in renewable fuels, hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, geothermal, and other things. And so there's a lot of work that's underway and that's very consistent with the pledge that you're referring to. And we haven't said never. We're still working some of the details on that particular initiative, which is one of many that we've signed on to already.
Okay. Tell us what does Chevron look like in 2050? You've made this big bet. You're going to continue taking oil and gas out of the ground. What is the energy mix, and what does that look like in 2050 as you're targeting to meet net zero, at least for Scope 1 and 2?
Yeah, so we're a company that's been around for 144 years. We were founded in 1879, and at that point in time, our products were used for lighting because most of the lamp oil in the world came from whales. And it turned out that what was then known as rock oil or kerosene was cleaner burning, more affordable, and more abundant than whale oil was. And 50 years after that, we were barely beginning to produce gasoline because cars had just been introduced. And so through the evolution of our history, we've seen the demand for our products and the mix of our business evolve dramatically. I think by 2050, that will happen once again. The world will still be using oil and gas. I think we'll be producing oil and gas. But I think our renewable fuels business will be much larger than it is today. I think we'll have a good-sized hydrogen business by then. We're just beginning to capture carbon and store it. We've got projects in both Australia and Canada that take CO2 out of industrial processes and store them in the earth. That will be a much larger business when we get out to 2050. And I fully expect there are technologies that are not mature today, some of which people may not even be talking about, that will become part of our business by the time we get out to 2050, which has been the history throughout all of our existence.
You talked in our prep session about how you think that dollars should be spent on technologies and investments that take the most CO2 out of the air per dollar spent. Does carbon capture qualify as such an investment?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Our belief is we ought to try to get the most carbon abatement for every dollar we spend. And so as we look at our own business, we go through a process where we look at the marginal cost of abatement for every emission we have, and you start at the ones that give you the most benefit for every dollar that you spend. If you look at public policy, people like McKinsey do the same thing across the global economy, and EV subsidies, by some of their work, reduce CO2 at the cost of $450 or $500 per ton of CO2. Carbon capture and storage, by most analyses, is in the $75 to $100 range. And so it's nearly an order of magnitude more benefit for every dollar you would spend on carbon capture than you would on an EV subsidy. So we do think that broad-based carbon policy, a price on carbon, which is politically difficult but economically very efficient, is something that we should continue to work toward in this country and in other countries.
I just want to push a little bit more on carbon capture. Does it make sense to basically pay to capture carbon? I mean, are you siphoning investment that could be going into clean energy infrastructure to pay to capture carbon that you are putting into the atmosphere by continuing to burn fossil fuels? Does that make sense as an approach?
Yeah, so if you look at the IPCC or other independent studies that are done, they'll particularly, when they address the most difficult to electrify sectors of the economy, so manufacturing steel or cement or aluminum require tremendous amounts of heat for the process that is required to make these fundamental building blocks for our society. And there really is no other way other than using the combustion of fossil fuels to create that heat, at least with today's technologies. And so this is a process that can be used to capture emissions that are otherwise very difficult to eliminate without eliminating some of the things that we rely on in society. Now, there may be advances one day that allow us to manufacture some of these materials using entirely different processes, and we'd love to see that happen. But in the meantime, we need to have every solution. I sometimes talk to people about this, and you get into a conversation about we don't want oil and gas or we don't want nuclear. As we rule things out and narrow the solution set, it makes it much more challenging. We actually need all of them, and they'll all play a role, and over time that mix is likely to evolve.
So this helps to explain why you are betting that with the Hess deal that there will be a need for oil and gas for decades to come. On the Hess deal, do you expect to be able to close that? You're facing an FTC investigation.
Yeah, certainly, many large transactions, we all file, with the FTC when you announce a deal. And then and the FTC can ask for more information as you go through the approval process there. So we're preparing responsive documents for their request. We don't see any substantive. There's very little overlap between our two businesses, and so we don't see a meaningful antitrust challenge there. We're certainly working with the Commission, and we expect to close the deal next year.
You have in the past commented on mixed signals from the Biden administration on energy policy. You had a pretty high-profile dust-up with the president about a year ago. You pushed back on some of his comments about oil and gas producers. What do you see now? What would you like to see policy-wise? And do you still think that you're getting these mixed signals from the administration? Yeah,
the discussion on energy and climate has become very polarized. And it's become reduced to you're either for or against the environment or energy security. And what I think we'd really benefit from is a more balanced and pragmatic conversation about the topic. There are really three things around the world that matter when it comes to energy. One, it has to be affordable in order to change lives, to help an economy grow and develop. Second, it has to be reliable. And I travel to places in the world where the lights go off in the middle of meetings, and it's very difficult to build an industrial base, to build an economy with unreliable energy, or to have an industrialized economy like we've seen in Europe, where their primary source of energy gets disrupted. So reliable supply and energy security matter, and then of course the environment matters. We all want to see a clean environment and a sustainable world. What often can happen in energy policy is it can tilt to one of those and at the detriment of the others. And so if all you care about is affordability, you're going to get an environment that nobody wants to live in. Reliability can create costs to create redundancy in supply that an economy can't afford, and you can create vulnerability, as we've seen in Europe, if you focus so much on the environment that you create unintended risks on the other two. And so balance is something that I think has been missing from this discussion, not only in this country, but in many others.
So what kinds of unintended consequences do you worry are being created by US policy right now?
Well,
energy security or supply?
Well, we certainly have seen a lot of growth. You know, the U.S. is the biggest oil producer in the world. It's the biggest liquefied natural gas producer. And so in spite of some policies that have evolved from administration to administration, we're blessed with an abundance of resource and a very large and capable industry. And as the biggest energy consumer in the world, our economy has benefited from that. Over time, the risk is that we try to choose winners and losers with policy, and you know, government's track record there is not as good as market's track record of sorting these things out over time. And so we really run the risk of kind of building up businesses. You can look a little bit at what's happening right now. I think EV production seems to be getting ahead of consumer demand for electric vehicles. And markets are really the best place to sort out this allocation of capital and evolution within boundaries of performance-based standards. And so I think that we would benefit from policies that level the playing field, don't pick technology winners, but set strong performance standards on environmental and other dimensions, and then let markets sort out the mix.
Like carbon pricing, for example.
Yeah, carbon pricing is a great example.
How are you thinking about geopolitical risk these days? There was an incident this morning, apparently a Houthi missile hit a Norwegian tanker and oil markets slipped, oil prices slipped. How are you evaluating risk and thinking about the Middle East in particular?
Yeah, geopolitical risk is part of our world every day. We're exposed to the war in Russia and Ukraine. We're exposed to the situation in the Middle East as a producer of natural gas offshore Israel for the Israeli, Jordanian, and Egyptian economies. We've had a couple of our ships attacked by Iranian naval forces this year, one of which was actually taken into a port and it still sits there today, another which was under fire for several hours from an Iranian frigate until the U.S. Navy showed up. And we actually moved our shipping activities primarily over to the Red Sea because it was, although costlier, safer. And of course, as the situation now has evolved, the Red Sea is subject to some of these same risks. And so geopolitical risk is something we manage every day in every part of the world.
What is your view, just shifting slightly to the economy? We saw inflation numbers this morning and heard from Janet Yellen. What's your view? Are you in the soft landing camp?
We certainly have been anticipating the recession that never seems to arrive, and the odds of a slowdown but not a hard landing seem to have increased. China has begun to come out of its post-COVID period of time, and so you know, the signals broadly remain pretty strong globally. As I mentioned, demand for our product is at an all-time high this year and is expected to go up again next year. And so I would say that our concerns about a sharp slowdown have diminished over the last few quarters.
What about hiring? What do you see in the labor market? Are you still hiring the way you have been for the last number of years?
We are, and we tend to hire a lot of engineers, some operating personnel at our operating facilities, and we've still got very high acceptance rates, high application rates, and have not had problems accessing talent. We have very low turnover. We've got about 40,000 people worldwide, and our annual turnover is on the order of 3%. So we don't have a lot of attrition in our business, and so our hiring needs are relatively stable, and we've been able to meet the needs without real issues.
But you haven't pulled back on hiring or slowed down?
No, our hiring is as we had expected.
I'd like to go to the audience for questions if anybody has any questions for Mike, either on the energy transition, the economy, COP. Okay, let me ask you something then. COP was supposed to initially, it was supposed to wind up today. Now I think it's going to tomorrow. They're having their final press conference, and this draft agreement apparently will contain language along the lines of aiming to limit unabated fossil fuel use. When you read that, what does that mean to you? What does that actually tell you as a guideline? What does unabated fossil fuel use mean?
Well, so we talked a little bit about carbon capture and storage, which is a form of abatement. So if you're using fossil fuels, it's a way to mitigate that use by capturing the CO2. I think the thing that this discussion would benefit from is there's a lot of focus on supply. So let's use less oil and gas, let's use less coal. There's not as much discussion about demand. And constraining supply, as we saw last year when Europe had a forced supply constraint on natural gas, if demand doesn't adjust with it, just leads to a higher price. And so I think a more productive discussion would be, where is demand going? How do we shape demand over time? And are there ways with energy efficiency, which is not a very sexy topic, but it's a really important topic, is the best way to reduce emissions is to use less energy and find ways to use energy more efficiently. So we don't have as many of these discussions about demand as we do about how to constrain or reshape supply, and I think the demand side of the equation is part of the conversation that could benefit from a lot more discussion.
On the supply side, some people have looked at the oil and gas industry and looked at also this spate of deals, the consolidation that we're seeing, especially in the United States, your deal, the Exxon deal, the Occidental deal, and wondered are these signs of a sunsetting industry? Is this shrinkage? Where do you see the industry going in the next number of years?
Yeah, our view is that demand will continue to grow through the end of this decade. It probably plateaus sometime out there past that, but it's really hard, and we do a lot of different modeling and try to force demand down through a variety of assumptions about technology, efficiency, economic growth, et cetera. And it's really hard to bend the demand curve sharply lower. And so, we operate in a world where we got customers today that we need to meet their demands today. And our view is that will flatten. And so we will reach a point where demand for oil flattens, and at some point in time it will begin to decline. But we're really talking decades, not years.